Hey guys, what's going on? Shaw here, and today we're going to be doing something that you all seem to like. We're going to be taking another look at logs and breaking it down into more of an objective format where I'm going to be looking at logs, looking at the different damage profiles of dungeons, and then putting into a pseudo tier list. I'm not going to be using tier maker like I did last time. I'm simply just going to be looking at a chart that's based off a point system, which I'll explain later in this video. In these, I looked at logs on Warcraft logs, so it's all accessible information for you guys, but I'm going to have a link in the comments below that'll show you access to my information that I used and most of that aggregated data. But I'll be explaining it through this video, so that doesn't matter. So what I looked at is I looked at physical damage taken, magical damage taken, and melee damage taken from the tank's perspective, of course, because this is a tanking channel for the most part. And we're going to be seeing how the dungeons differ. Is it heavy melee? Is it heavy physical? Is it heavy magical? Or is it a mixture of everything? And then how you might be mitigating that damage and why I'm excited for Shadowlands as a whole because of the different profiles of all the dungeons. Now, just to explain, the logs that I looked at could have been anywhere from 8 to 16s. The thing about these keys is that while the overall damage might be different, the percentage and the values of the damage that was taken are going to be the same. So whether you took 4 million, melee damage or 2 million melee damage because of the key difference and disparity, it's going to be the same percentage, if that makes sense. Another thing that I had to leave out was monk logs. Any kind of brewmaster logs was kind of hard to look at because it would turn some of the magical damage into stagger, and it would turn some of the melee damage into stagger and the physical damage, so on and so forth. As you guys can understand, that could be a little bit more difficult to pick apart. So monk logs aren't in this, though it remains the same for them. It's just that stagger showing in logs is a little bit different. So with all of that in mind, we're going to jump right in. If this is the kind of content you do like, though, please hit that sub button down below and that like button, and we're going to dive right in. Let's go. So here's the data in a sheet that's kind of aggregated data of the aggregated data. So this is all the data that I've compiled and I've put into this Excel sheet to make some nice little graphs for you, but I'm going to be going through those graphs in a second. But essentially what I've done is I've broken down the melee average percentage, the physical damage percentage, and the magical damage percentage for each of the 8 dungeons. These are color-coded based on zones, so you have 2 in each of the new zones. So you have Ardenweld, you have Revendreth, you have this yellow, I didn't know really what to do, white seemed boring, Bastion zone, and then you have Maldraxxus. So essentially this is what I'm looking at data percentage wise, but we're going to jump into it and break it down graph by graph in no particular order at all. Some of you guys are going to laugh that I'm using Microsoft Edge, but it's just what PDF opens up as, so I've put these all into a PDF document to make them easier to see. So orange, the orange color is going to be melee damage. It's going to be raw melee damage, which is able to be mitigated by most tanks just passively, or part of their active mitigation by increasing armor, increasing block, things like that. So you want to see a lot of orange or a lot of this melee damage because it's the easiest damage to mitigate by the tank. We then have orange, or this like red. This red color is going to be physical damage that's not necessarily melee. So these might be some kind of special attacks or some kind of like AoE, some kind of like ground smash thing. Typically some of these are avoidable. Some of these are things like headbutts or like bleed effects. So Halls of Atonement is notorious for having this thing called like Jagged Swipe, which a lot of tanks are going to hate, so bring a paladin to bop it. But that's what this red section is going to be, and this is going to be true for all the graphs. And then purple is going to be magic damage, so anything from curses to diseases to frost damage, fire damage. I've left out affixes. So despite the different logs being anywhere from like level 5 keys all the way up to level like 15, 16 keys, it's the damage taken over the course of the key is going to be a lot higher, obviously between 5 and 16 because there's a pretty big disparity between key level and the multiplier, but the percentage of the damage taken is going to remain quite the same outside of additional affixes like Grievous, Bursting, people sitting in Volcanic, not Inspiring, what's it called, Spiteful. So like Spiteful melees obviously are a different thing. So I've left all this information out. I've removed them from the logs to get as much of an accurate estimate as possible over the course of the key. So long story short, we're going to go through these dungeons really quickly to try to break them down, then I'm going to rate them on a point system. So Theater of Pain, you're going to see about 60% melee and another 16% physical. So this is a fairly good percentage or representation. This Theater of Pain is sitting like middle of the pack. So, and then it's on its counterpart, you're going to see Plaguefall, which has a lot more melee damage and a lot less specific like physical damage taken, but the magical damage will be similar to what you see here in Theater of Pain, and this is going to come through things like poisons. Like Plague Fall is known for having a lot of poison effects and disease effects, so those kind of dispels are going to be really good in a dungeon like this. And then obviously a higher melee percentage means most tanks are going to be able to mitigate this fairly well. And then also another side note is I am looking this at it's the damage taken by the tank, not necessarily the group. The tank's obviously going to take a lot more damage, and there's things that are relatively avoidable or kickable that's from the group. So group damage I'm not concerned about too much. I'm obviously focusing on tanks in this video. So with that being said, let's keep moving on. Next we have Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension has even a higher physical damage at 76.8%, or not physical, sorry, melee attack. Physical will be 8.3, putting it at like an 85% physical damage taken, and then there's a slight bit of 15% magic damage taken. Now this is typically like random casts, and sometimes it can go on the tank, sometimes it can go on the melee, sometimes these can be kicked and interrupted and they won't go off at all. So this number will change a pretty good amount, but a generic sense is this is the kind of damage profile this dungeon's going to offer. Moving on, we have Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake's going to be a lot less melee attacks and a lot of physical damage. And you're going to see this once you get up into the Necropolis, that there's like a lot of different like bleeds and like just melee effects, like armor reduction kind of abilities, like mutilates, things like that are going to come in, be a pretty big presence in Necrotic Wake, so you're going to want to keep an eye out for those. And then there's a lot less magical damage. Now this is a dungeon that's kind of skewed because there's different effects you can get in the dungeon. Like there's a lot of casters you can skip. There's like items you can use in the dungeon to either like completely eradicate mobs or to silence mobs. So this damage can change pretty drastically in Necrotic Wake, and so can the physical. Like sometimes the log people are actually going to be wanting. I don't know why you'd want to take more magical damage, but you can use those items on the things that are going to do physical damage to you to eliminate those. And then you're going to be taking more magical damage over the course of the key. So this can change. This is probably the biggest. This is the dungeon that can probably change the most in its damage profile. We then have Halls of Atonement. So again, lower physical, a little bit higher, or I keep messing it up. Lower melee, a little bit higher physical, and then magic damage is sitting right in that sweet spot around that 17% mark. And again, Halls of Atonement. There's some casts, there's cursed dispels, so having those in your group are going to lower or increase this amount of damage that you're going to be taking from those kind of effects. So again, that's something you might want to keep in mind for this dungeon, whether it's a mage or a shaman or a druid. That's going to reduce some of this damage as well. So I'm hoping in a future video to be able to break down some of these different, like, I want to take a deep dive into the magic profile and see what can be dispelled by what classes, so how you can mitigate this damage a little bit better. We then have Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths is another dungeon similar to Halls of Atonement, low melee, and it's going to have a higher amount of magical damage. The thing about this dungeon though is a lot of the things are casts and they can be kicked and CC'd, so having good like interruption and crowd control effects like Ring of Peace, Shockwave, Intimidating Roar, things like that are going to help mitigate a lot of this damage. So the logs that it was taken from, they might have either not been doing that, or they missed kicks, or they overlocked kicks. And again, it is still beta, so this damage could also be overtuned. We don't know. But you're going to be taking a lot of magical damage in Sanguine Depths, and I'm going to talk about that in a sec, how you might be able to mitigate that outside of, obviously, CC. And then lastly, we have, well, not lastly, the last zone, we have the other side, which is actually surprisingly a lot of physical melee damage and a very low amount of physical, and then most of it's going to be magical damage. So this is really like damage on your tank from melee, and then magical damage on your tank and the group from just random spell cast, AoE abilities, and things of such. So obviously like kicks, min-maxing strategies of like making sure you're either line of sighting things or making sure you're kicking things and having like structured CC chains will be important in the other side. And then lastly, we have Miss of Tyrna Scythe. This is heavy melee damage. Like this is probably going to be the best dungeon out there that you're going to be able to do because it's all melee, so tanks can easily mitigate this. And with that much melee, there's not as many things being casted onto the group, not a lot of casts, and those few casts that are present, you can kick, you can interrupt, you can CC, and then there's a little bit of AoE damage coming in from the physical side. So pretty good dungeon here. So I'm gonna break these down. So what I have done here is I actually probably should show you via the sheet. So what I've done here on the side, like just quickly as like a point system, is I wanted to give them I wanted to rank them 1 through 8. So it's out of 24 points. And so for melee damage, so the higher the possible. So I'm not golf score here. You don't want a lower score. You want a higher score. So out of 24 points, so 8, 8, and 8. Quick math, check it. Okay, so out of 24 points, 24 points is like the best dungeon, which means there's high melee damage, low physical, and low magical. I'm rating it flipped. So for melee damage here, you'll see that I ranked Mists 8, and 8's at the top here, because I think you get the most points for having the most amount of melee damage, because that's that damage can easily be mitigated by the tank. And then on the other end, we have magical and physical damage, which I've flopped because the highest magical damage taken, which is Sanguine Depths, is bad, because it means you have to either roll more cooldowns, you have to coordinate more CCs, and it's going to be worse for the pugging environment because people are kind of like throwing out whatever, whenever. And some pugs like don't even have kick on their bar. So looking at this from like a subjective perspective about like in a pugging environment, not as much of a coordinated group, Sanguine Depths is going to be a lot worse for pugs because of the amount of magical damage going out, which just means a higher healing throughputs, whether that's from the tank, healer, and your group in general. So that's why you'll see it flop like this. That's why I have 1 through 8, 1 through 8, and then oops, and then you'll see 8 through 1. So down here we have our point system, and I'm going to actually flop back over to this chart to explain it. So treat this like a tier list. I didn't feel like getting the images for tier maker and putting them in there. So at the lowest we have Sanguine Depths, and here's why. It's like it's one of the lowest melee damage dungeons, which means the tank can only mitigate so much of the damage up front, and a lot of it's going to be like physical attacks, which can only be partly mitigated, or sometimes it's AoE that it can be dodged, or it can't be dodged. And there's going to be a lot of magical damage as well. It's one of the highest magical damage and one of the highest physical damage taken. So it means there's going to be a high healing requirement for this dungeon, and there's also going to be a large amount of CC chains that are going to have to be coordinated to pull off this dungeon successfully, especially when you get to the higher end. And then even in the pug environment, because of all this damage, it just requires the pug healer is going to have to heal more. Like typically, you know, in the pug environment, not a lot of people kick. People kind of like throw out CCs whenever. A lot of things get overlapped, and that's just going to make the dungeon like arbitrarily more difficult to complete. So it's going to actually have a pretty high jump up. Then you're going to see these like 4 dungeons in kind of the middle. Halls of Atonement, Necrotic Wake, Theater of Pain, and the other side. All these dungeons have like a fairly decent amount of melee damage, which means most of it's on the tank to mitigate, which is good because it's something they can actively do all the time compared to using like big CDs like Shield Wall, Survival Instincts, Metamorphosis. It means they don't have to use this as often, and they can just mitigate it through their passive toolkit. And there is enough for the healer and the melee to have to do, like with kicks and making sure they do crowd control effects, but not so much where they're going to feel like they can't complete the key, or it's going to make the key like that much more difficult to get done. So these dungeons I'm kind of rating in the middle. They all have different kind of like damage profiles. Some have more physical, some have more magical, some are more like random, some are more AoE effects, and then some are more targeted at like either a tank or a specific player. So those are going to change how you're going to approach the key in some senses, but for the most part I'm going to kind of rank them in the middle for difficulty. And then you have, I would say, Spires and Plaguefall are in a similar boat because Missive's tier and Scythe is just well above everything else. But Plaguefall and Spires, you're going to have mostly melee damage. It's like 70 to 80%, which means, like I've been already saying this whole time, is that it can mostly be mitigated just by active mitigation that the tank has access to. And then there's going to be less kick and CC requirements. Plaguefall has a little bit of like more poison damage and a lot more like dot and rot damage, so like there's going to be a little bit of a healing requirement from there, but it's nothing that's going to like, it's not going to cause the key to fail. In most senses, they've done a lot of tuning with this dungeon lately, especially to like the last boss and some of the poison effects throughout the course of the key, so hoping to still see some more of those. I feel like some parts of that dungeon is still overtuned, but for the most part, despite it having like a horrible route and no reset, like ignoring the subjective stuff and kind of approaching it from objective, like damage profile wise, it's like in a really good spot. Obviously, like not having a good respawn, like being a Necrolord, not being able to use like your fleshcraft to actually like get a benefit, like there's been a bug with it. And then just like like how long the dungeon is, it's like Shrine of the Storm but without like a res point. It's ridiculous. So outside of that, pretty good dungeon breakdown, like damage profile. And Spires of Ascension, mainly physical, some AoE, some random cast, but again, things can be kicked, so good players can lock this down. But even if you like aren't necessarily like a good player and like you might miss a kick or overlap some CC, it's not going to punish you severely as it would in like Sanguine Depths, for example. And then lastly, we have Mists. Mists of Tyrna Scythe is just a dungeon that like is insanely good all around. Like if you look at this, this number is a little high. You're gonna sit there's like a 5 to 8% margin of like error here. It could be as low as like 75%, 78% physical damage, but like the magic damage and melee damage or physical damage, it is so small that like a lot of it comes down to just how well you can pull the key and how efficiently you get through that maze. And I think the reason for that is the maze design that they've included. Like they want you to make up for it and not have the dungeon be too punishing. The dungeon itself, like from my own personal subjective standpoint, it's really well designed. The boss encounters are kind of cool. I hate the second boss so much. I can't remember her name. Miss something. I don't remember. Little fairy lady. But this dungeon is more catered around to like, can your tank just mitigate? Cool. Like, how well can you execute the dungeon route, which is what I really like. So what I'm looking forward to, and like just because like Sanguine Depths is this low doesn't mean it's like necessarily a bad dungeon, is that the damage breakdown and like the damage profiles of these dungeons just make you have to bring different things. So what does this mean when it comes to like borrowed power? And this is my last point, I promise. I know this video is getting to like 16 minutes long. So what does this mean exactly? It means that like Mists of Tyrna Scythe, like your profile that you're gonna build out your character as is gonna be like fairly damage intensive, and you're gonna try to like speed run this dungeon. At least that's like my assumption, is that you're able to like drop some of your defensive values to like play a little bit more aggressive, which is really, really good and a lot of fun. Like everyone likes to do a lot of damage. The healers, at least I'm assuming, like to actually contribute some damage. The tanks like to see big numbers. The healers are still gonna have like a job, obviously, to heal and stuff, but it just means you're able to like brute force this a little bit easier without having to think too much. So like Spires of Ascension and Plaguefall, you're gonna maybe have to run a little bit more defensive, but like it's going to come down to like execution of certain packs. Like some things you have to have certain kick priorities in certain packs, which isn't like a huge deal, especially when you get to the higher end. Like that's really, really easy to do. So I think these dungeons are going to be a lot of fun. But then when you get to some of these lower ones, like you're gonna have to swap up your legendaries and your conduits to be maybe a little bit more defensive, your legendaries to be a little bit more defensive or like healing oriented, and there's gonna take a little bit more coordination in that. And that's what I'm really excited for. Is I'm excited that like as a Guardian Druid main in BFA, I ran the same like 3 pieces of Azurite the whole time, never really changed traits. I ran the same trinkets. I ran like the only thing I changed is like one minor essence, and it was only for like Freehold. Like if I was doing Freehold, I'd put on Aegis. If I was running any other key, I would put on like Nullification Dynamo. And having like different dungeons that are the success of the run is going to depend on the execution and like your defensive build or offensive build of your character and composition is going to be awesome. So in Sanguine Depths, it's like a fairly long timer for how much trash you have to go through. Like it's actually not that much. So it means like it's all about surviving every pull. Where Mists of Tyrna Scythe means like you could just push your way through very aggressively, and like if you do wipe or if you have like a slip up, like it's more forgiving, and the different dungeon profiles in general is just going to be really, really engaging. And I'm super excited for this. But that's pretty much my video. So I've just been dissecting logs the last few days and just trying to break it down. So I've aggregated all this data. I'm going to share it down below. Once I aggregate or not, like once I get all the data into here, I still have to put all the logs that I have in. I have some metrics here, but you're going to be able to see this and take a look. If I missed anything or if I totally like got this wrong, please let me know. I just thought it was kind of an interesting concept to look at the different profiles of every dungeon, because there normally are, and it just means a different play style. So I'm super excited. If you liked content like this, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It lets me know to keep doing stuff like this. And if you have any ideas, always shoot me a message or a comment in the section below. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you're having a great night or day or whenever you're deciding to watch this, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.